This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Roger, that's a rough get right now, over.
Welcome to True Spies, Brief Histories. We're living through an era in which the impact of spies, subterfuge and covert influence is increasingly visible. We're bombarded with news about foreign interference, wartime propaganda and threats from cyberspace. And that's just for starters. But how did we get here? In these bonus minisodes, we'll explore the long history of spycraft. And with the help of our deep bench of espionage experts, we'll bring you up to speed on the past, present and possible future of this ancient profession.
I said, just a matter of interest. How many women do you have in your service? He said, John, we don't employ women. How can you exclude half the population when it is known that women are better case handlers and agent handlers than men?
I'm Joe Foley, series producer for True Spies. And this is a brief history of women in espionage. If all our years making True Spies have taught us anything, it's that where there's power at stake, there's espionage. And where there's espionage, women play their part. You'll find examples of that in some of the oldest texts on the planet. So why not kick this episode off with one of the most ancient and best known? The stories you'll find in the Old Testament of the Bible are shared by every Abrahamic religion, and they paint a picture of a stranger, more mystical world than the one we live in now. But they also give us some small insight, however distorted by millennia of translation and retranslation, into the geopolitics of the Bronze Age Levant, and how those ancient kingdoms might have vied for supremacy. Take the story of Samson, the superpowered Israelite warrior, and his lover Delilah. Now, according to the Book of Judges, Samson was born during a time of near constant conflict between Israel and Philistia. So, as an adult gifted with divine strength, he spent quite a lot of his time killing Philistines, which understandably they weren't crazy about. But there wasn't much they could do about it. After all, Samson was very, very strong. The Philistines were never going to win a straight confrontation. We're talking slings and arrows versus a human tank, essentially. But if they could find a way to deprive Samson of his specific set of skills, they might stand a chance. So they did what any modern state would do. They mounted an intelligence effort against Samson, identified a vulnerability, and used it. It so happened that Samson, fresh from slaughtering 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass, see what I mean about the tank thing, was winding his merry way through Gaza, where he met a charming young woman called Delilah. Samson's new entanglement didn't escape the Philistines' notice, and they targeted his lover for recruitment. Now, on True Spies, we always talk about the reasons people spy, and one handy acronym we revisit pretty regularly is MICE. Money, ideology, coercion, ego. In the story, Delilah's motivation was money, 1,100 pieces of silver to be exact, although we mustn't discount the possibility of a touch of coercion too. Either way, Delilah was tasked with discovering the source of Samson's immense strength, and after a bit of trial and error, figured out that his long hair was the key to it all. So in the dead of night, Delilah cut Samson's locks, allowing the Philistines to blind him, enslave him, and crucially, take him off the battlefield. So take everything else away, the miracles, the pacts with God, and this is a textbook honey trap operation, right at the heart of one of the world's oldest stories. The honey trap is a role that female characters in movies, myths and novels are often limited to. The high-heeled femme fatale, the Bond girl who inevitably betrays the hero, just as he's falling in love. And before we go on, we need to acknowledge that in most societies, the balance of power has historically been weighted heavily towards men. The exploitation of women's bodies has been a part of that, and the realm of espionage is no exception. But in this brief history, we're going to explore the many different ways that real female spies have operated in the field, as heroines in their own stories, for better or for worse. Tang Dynasty China, the 7th century CE. Wu Zetian, a young woman in her 20s, is in a perilous position. She's a concubine to the Emperor Taizong, a position of relative privilege by the standards of the time. But that's about to change. Taizong is dead, and she and all the other concubines are due to be packed off to a nunnery. But Wu Zetian has a trump card to play. She's managed to win the heart of the old emperor's son, the new emperor, in other words. This emperor, Gaizong, decides to save her from her fate and add her to his own harem. Now, if we go by the historical sources, this is probably the last time Wu Zetian relied on a man for anything. Beautiful, educated and ruthless, she set about removing her competitors, including the new emperor's wife and his chief concubine. By the year 655, she was Gaizong's empress, and when he suffered a stroke 5 years later, she consolidated her power and effectively became the first and only female ruler in China's history. So she'd come a long way, but taking power is one thing. Keeping it with the jealous eyes of an empire at your back is another. Luckily, by this point, Wu Zetian was no stranger to intrigue. The 10th century Book of Tang tells us that she established a network of palace women as spies, feeding her intelligence on would-be rivals, who she could then have quietly or not so quietly neutralised. It would likely have been the first network of its kind in China. Male emperors tended to rely on eunuchs, who they could trust to keep their secrets and find out those of others, without angling for the throne themselves. No kids, no dynasty. But Wu Zetian didn't stop there. She was a true revolutionary, sweeping away the layers of palace bureaucracy that separated her from the word on the street. One example of this is the copper or bronze mailboxes that she had installed around her empire, through which citizens could report corruption, slander, or any other anti-state activity directly to their empress. It feels almost Soviet, the idea of a people informing on each other, and according to later Confucian writers, she created a similar atmosphere of paranoia and extreme fealty. But it's worth noting that, as with much of ancient history, Wu's story comes to us through male historians, many of whom might have wished to discourage other women following in her footsteps. Whatever the truth of the matter is, we can glean that Wu Zetian was both a powerful ruler and a ruthless spy mistress. So let's skip now in time and space from 7th century China to medieval England, as complex an arena for espionage as you could ever hope to find.
So women have lots of different roles within espionage or within intelligence gathering.
That's the voice of Dr. Jenny Benham, a historian at the University of Cardiff. On the True Spies debrief, we spoke to her about the various intricacies of medieval spycraft, and women were absolutely a part of that conversation.
So we have the women that are outright spies. So these are the women who are both gathering and carrying kind of that information to the king, for example, or to someone who is what we might think of as her handler.
Dr. Benham's research has thrown up an interesting example.
A woman called Alice of Saint. She exists in the reign of King John, so very early 13th century. She appears in the court records of King John's household, where she is very clearly being paid for her espionage services. She is very specifically denoted as a spy, whatever we think that might have meant.
King John's paperwork doesn't actually tell us exactly what Alice was up to.
But what is quite clear is that she is paid quite a lot of money, much more money than most messengers or most envoys would be paid. And so from that, we can kind of gather that probably she's being paid danger money, right?
So what do we know about Alice? Well, she was a secular member of a nunnery in the city of Saintes in southwestern France.
which is highly contested. It was one of the parts of the English king's continental lands that he actually retained after he lost Normandy in 1204. But this particular part of southwestern France is one of the regions that he managed to hold on to, at least for a while. So we can imagine from a strategic point of view, she is extremely well placed.
We also know about one of her missions in the year 1212.
This was a year when King John wanted to launch another campaign on the continent in order to recover some of the lands that he had lost. And for that, information about what was going on in this southwestern region would, of course, have been really valuable to him. He ended up having to suspend his military campaign because there basically was rumors of a rebellion in England. And so as a consequence, he cancelled this and it ends up being delayed for about 2 years. And it is just after it has been cancelled that Alice then turns up in England, relaying some sort of information to him that we don't exactly know what it was. If I was to speculate, I would probably say that it's something to do with, the loyalty of the lords, for example, or expectations about what they might have been expecting from this military campaign.
These cooler days call for layers that last. And Quince is my go-to for quality essentials that feel cosy, look refined, and won't blow your budget. By working directly with ethical factories and cutting out middlemen, they deliver timeless, high-quality clothing at a fraction of the usual price. Quince is that rare combination. Smart, stylish, and effortless. It's a wardrobe upgrade you'll feel rather clever about. I've just added one of Quince's cashmere jumpers to my wardrobe, and I honestly couldn't be more delighted. It's beautifully soft, lightweight yet warm, and drapes in that effortless way only proper cashmere does. Find your fall staples at Quince. Go to quince.com/truespies for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada, too. That's quince.com/truespies to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/truespies.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
Female messengers like Alice of Saint, who could move across national borders without arousing too much suspicion, were invaluable tools for medieval rulers. But as we learned in the last episode of Brief Histories, intelligence networks during this period were pretty loose. It was only later on, in the early modern period, that spycraft as a tool of the state began to formalise. Which brings us neatly to one of the first female spies to start working within that new paradigm, the playwright and novelist Aphra Behn. Aphra was born around 1640, in an England that was careening towards a civil war between parliamentarians who didn't want a king and the royalists who predictably did. Long story short, there was a civil war, and the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, won. They executed the king, Charles I. But Cromwell's regime didn't last, and after a brief period of parliamentarian rule, the dead king's son, Charles II, was restored to the throne. And Aphra Behn was one of his most loyal supporters. We don't know much about her early life. What little we have suggests that she was from a relatively humble background and was largely self-educated. But the record shows that by the mid-1660s at least, she was working for the crown. In 1665, war broke out between England and the Netherlands, the second in a series of conflicts between the two colonial powers. Aphra Behn was sent to Antwerp to gather intelligence on the Dutch war effort by recruiting informants. She did so by cultivating relationships with people in political and intellectual circles who might have had access to military intelligence. And here her gender probably worked in her favour. Espionage simply wasn't something women did, or so people believed. But her main target was a man called William Scott, and where he was concerned, Aphra was in trouble. William was the son of Thomas Scott, one of the politicians who had signed Charles I's death warrant. Word had got out that William might be amenable to spying for the British. He had great contacts with the Dutch, as well as the community of British exiles living in the Low Countries. So Aphra Behn was asked to cultivate him as a source. And she made a very good go of it, appealing to William's loyalty to his homeland and to his purse. But unfortunately, she was being played. William Scott was a double agent, feeding information to the British and the Dutch alike. Aphra suspected as much too, but as far as we can tell, her intelligence wasn't taken seriously. And all this was made worse by the fact that, unlike many modern spies, Aphra wasn't being paid a salary, funding the operation herself. She had to repeatedly ask for payment, which had been promised but wasn't forthcoming. Here's an excerpt from one of her reports to her handlers in London, complaining that the pursuit of William Scott is sending her broke. I confess, I carried no more but £50, and I have not only spent all of that upon mere eating and drinking, but in borrowing of money to accomplish my desires of seeing and speaking with the man. I am as much more in debt, having pawned my very rings. Ultimately, Aphra's mission failed. She returned to London in 1667, frustrated and much, much poorer. Male spies in the same era don't seem to have had to beg for the money to keep their operations afloat, and she channeled her frustration into her creative work in the years to come. Her reputation took a hit too. Neither spying nor writing for money were considered to be appropriate work for women in her era. But whatever people said about her, the facts remain. Aphra Behn was a pioneer in every field she chose. 200 years later, and thousands of miles away, during another civil war, another mould-breaking female spy was making her mark on history. On June 2nd, 1863, 3 steamboats came churning down the Combahee River in South Carolina. The vessels were packed with soldiers from the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, a black regiment of the Union Army. The boats removed the mines that the Confederates had lain through the waters of the Combahee. The 2nd Carolina made land, overwhelmed the enemy, and put the torch to the plantations that lined the river. Over 750 enslaved people were freed that day, and there to witness this achievement was the person who made it happen, greeting the freed captives in a sodden dress. Her name was Harriet Tubman. It's a name any American schoolchild will recognise as the architect of the Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and anti-slavery activists that brought enslaved people from the South into the abolitionist states of the North. But what's less well known is her role as a military spy during the American Civil War. And it's the history of the Combahee River Raid that gives us the best insight into this part of her life, because that operation wouldn't have been possible without months of intelligence gathering beforehand. Prior to the raid, Tubman had led a small group of scouts into South Carolina and established a network of contacts with the local enslaved population. She was able to form bonds with her sources that white Union officers wouldn't have been able to, and drew on her experiences in the Underground Railroad to covertly communicate with them. Through those sources, Harriet gathered intel on Confederate troop movements and supply caches. Enslaved boatmen were able to tell her where those mines had been laid in the river, allowing those bristling steamboats to chart a safe course to their destination. On the day of the Combahee River raid, Harriet guided the boats along the river. She watched as they completed their mission. There's no doubt that her contribution to its success was incalculable, and yet, like Aphra Behn 2 centuries earlier, she went unpaid. After the war was over, she lobbied fiercely for a military pension, but the army denied her requests. As a woman, she could never have formally joined up, after all. It was only in 1899, more than 30 years later, that they paid her some of what she was owed. Inevitably, women like Harriet Tubman weren't given their due without a fight. And that's also true of the woman at the heart of the last story I'll be sharing today, Marthe Cohn. Marthe was from a Jewish family in the French province of Lorraine, near the border with Germany. In 1942, she and her sister helped German Jews to escape over the border into France, and in 1944 she decided to take the fight one step further. She carried supplies to resistance fighters in the forests along the border, and in doing so had a chance encounter with a French resistance intelligence officer who spotted her potential.
He explained to me that in Germany all the males from the age of 12 to old age were in uniform in the army. So any man in civilian clothes in the streets of Germany would be immediately noticed and arrested. That's why they needed women. And he asked me if I accepted to be transferred to the intelligence service.
She said yes. In her 20s, 4'11" and wayfishly thin, Mart made an unlikely spy. People had a tendency to underestimate her, and that would work to her advantage when she crossed into enemy territory undercover. In January 1945, her life as a spy began. She started by creating a new German identity for herself, and the new Mart was a tragic figure. A nurse searching for a soldier fiancé who'd been captured by Russians on the Eastern Front. This was someone who had every motivation to be asking questions. Cover in place, she began her work.
I trained to recognize anything for the whole army, German army. As soon as I looked at a soldier, I could recognize what kind of regiment he belonged to. And I had to learn coding to decode or to write it in code.
When Allied forces were preparing to invade Germany in the spring of 45, Mart was asked to gather crucial intelligence on what lay in wait for them.
We didn't know what was going on in Germany. That's why I was sent to Germany for two purposes. For military intelligence, of course, but also intelligence how the civilians were behaving and reacting to the war, which was very important for the Allied armies which were going to invade Germany.
Mart made her way to the German town of Freiburg, situated close to Germany's western defensive border, the Siegfried Line. There, she hoped to gather information from anti-Nazi contacts of the French resistance. But when she was there, she noticed something unusual. The embattled Germans would walk from A to B in groups, safety in numbers and all that. So, Mart decided to join one of those groups and struck up a conversation with an SS officer recently back from the Russian front.
He had been wounded on the Russian front, and now he was recovering, and he was assigned to the Siegfried Line, which was northwest of Freiburg. He told us that he smells a Jew a mile away, and I was walking next to him, and he never smelled me, to show how stupid that was.
But the pace of the walk and the conversation was too much for the SS man. He fainted, and Mart, in keeping with her cover identity as a nurse, helped him to recover. When the soldier regained consciousness, he was so grateful that he invited Mart to visit him on the Siegfried Line, a perfect opportunity for her to gather intelligence. But when she arrived, the place was near enough deserted. The Nazi army had lost heart, and the Allies were approaching fast. Back in Freiburg, Mart witnessed the first Allied tanks rolling in. But she had to let them know that she wasn't really a German.
I raised my two fingers, the V sign of Winston Churchill, the victory sign. So I raised my arm as high as I could.
Luckily, those tanks were French tanks, and they spoke her language. They were very interested to know that the Siegfried Line was deserted. The intel gave the troops the confidence to make a swift advance, and history in some small part was written by Mart Cohn. Mart passed away in 2025 at the age of 105. You can hear her full story in the True Spies episode, The Survivor. Her legacy, her refusal to be underestimated or discounted, is something that all the women we've discussed here have in common. And today, women play vital roles in every aspect of intelligence work.
So I was at a conference in Cambridge, and I made the bold statement that women make better case officers, case handlers, than men.
Over on the True Spies debrief, Morgan Childs spoke to former British Foreign Office official and sometime consultant John Taylor about the roles women are playing in the conflicts that are unfolding even as you listen to this podcast.
Most of the women I know have had more experience with this from birth. than men. And so I wonder if you think this is something that intelligence agencies recognize.
Women are the bearers of children and tend to do most of the looking after of children. I know it's not exclusively like that, but it tends to be like that. And therefore, you're much more women are grown up to be much more sensitive about the sounds and the body language and everything else that they see in their daughter or their son. This makes them more sensitive,
and also to protect their own, well-being,
exactly.
safety.
In 2014, John was doing some work with one of the Ukrainian intelligence services. Russia had just invaded Crimea. They needed all the help they could get.
We were redesigning the agency's training program. And I was talking to the head of the agency. I said, just a matter of interest, how many women do you have in your service? He said, John, we don't employ women. I said, how can you exclude half the population when it is known that women are better case handlers, agent handlers, than men in general? I mean, there's a lot of overlap. Of course there is.
Sure.
Anyway, we talked about it, and a couple of months later, he called me into his office and said, John, we've just recruited our first 3 women. So I was really chuffed at that. And at the end of the course, one of them was they didn't rank them precisely, but one was in the top 3 and the other 2 were in the top half, which proved our point.
As a visit to the SPYSCAPE Museum in New York or London will attest, everybody has some of the skills, traits and abilities that make for an effective spy. And luckily, we're not living in the past, so that really does mean everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this spin through the stories of some of history's greatest female spies. For more stories about the women who've survived and thrived in the world of espionage, be sure to search for Spy Sisters, a specially selected box set of True Spies stories, available wherever you get your podcasts. And for an exclusive ad-free experience, including early releases and bonus content, be sure to subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. I'm Joe Foley. Thanks for listening.